Hi everyone, today's video is going to be my build for the Diecast Mafia 1950 to 1979 truck challenge. For this challenge you were to take a casting of a truck built between 1950 and 1979 and either restore or customise it. Naturally I'm going gaslands with this, and for this I'm using this Hot Wheels 52 Chevy. So I disassembled this casting. I accidentally broke the base, which I will be fixing later, but for now I'm going to dechrome it by dipping it into a jar full of bleach and then making sure to wash these parts off camera later on. While this was happening, I decided to work on the body. So first I start by removing the truck's bed, and I'm just going to use my jewel saw to cut this off. And then decided to take off the front fenders because I'm going with an off-road kind of look for this truck. Once the base was dechromed, I took some super glue and then glued the two pieces back together. Next I cut the back section of the base down just to leave the frame rails. And then clean this up with my hobby knife. After this I checked the clearance of the rear wheels. So following this I kind of needed to trim a bit more off, just so I had decent clearance so the wheels wouldn't catch anything. And after a quick test fit, everything seems perfect. And then move back to the front to fill this gap now exposed by the removed fenders. For this I just draw it out on a piece of styrene and then cut this piece out, marking and cutting where I need to make it fit. With the new panels I then glue them in place. I do the same for the rear section of the cab because there's a chunk missing now the bed's not there. Once the new panel's in place, I use some super glue to keep it there. Next I trim off these tabs to protect the axle from getting bent. And then use a file to smooth on the surface for the new axles. Following this I then cut the new axle tubes from some styrene tube. And then glue them into place. Then using the new axle tubes as reference, I cut some styrene rod for the new axles. For the front wheels I'm using Chemsol Designs 14mm Tyre 7 Rim 7. And for the rear wheels I'm using 14mm Tyre 8 Rim 8. I then glue one each of the front wheels and back wheels to the axles just so I can test fit the wheels and make sure there's plenty of clearance as I progress with the build. And I'll glue the other ones on once I finish the build. Next I begin work on the roll cage at the back using some styrene rod, marking out, cutting and then bending into shape. before then gluing it into place. Next I made the rear section, which again just did the same, and then glue these into place too. After this I used some screws for the front shocks, using super glue to attach them. And here's a quick look of what they look like with the wheel on, as well as checking for clearance. For the rear shocks I used some longer screws, and then these simply slot between the roll cage frame and the rear axle. And then test fit the rear wheels to make sure everything's got plenty of clearance before gluing them into place. Next I plan to replace the windows with some mesh. To do this I simply line up the mesh with the side window and then roughly cut out the mesh to the same size. And then trim this down to fit the side window. And after a quick test fit I glue it in place. Obviously I do the same for the rest of the windows, as you can see here. Next I decided to add this gun to the front from the Auto Kill Double Trouble sprue. To make it fit flush with the hood, I cut off this little mounting tab. And then glue it onto the hood. After this I add this barrel from the Auto Kill Arena sprue, which is going to be an oil dropper. And this simply just slots in between the two frame rails at the back, and then I add some super glue to keep it in place. Next I go about making some fog lights. Now for this I'm using two different pieces of styrene square rod. To do this I cut a small slice from each and then glue them together like so. And I then glue these to the roll bar at the back. Following this I add some more detail to the axles by making the differentials. And now for this I just cut a piece of styrene tube and then split it down the middle so it can be slot over the original axle that's already glued in. I also add a rhinestone to add to the detail. Off camera I do this for the front axle too. After this I add a drive shaft, which is simply made up of some styrene rod. I then make the exhausts. For this I cut down and bend some styrene rod. And then trim off the excess. And next I hull out one of the ends with my hobby knife, like so. Finally, to complete this I make the heat shield, which I just use some styrene tube which I split down the middle and slot over the top. And with this done I then glue this in place behind the cab. Next I wanted to fill up this empty space behind the cab and the oil dropper. So I grabbed this box from the Auto Kill Hunting Party sprue, which I then glued into place. I then added this crate from the Red Dog 172 storage pack that I had. And on top of that I added this little rucksack, which is again from the same pack. And now I finally move on to painting. As usual, I start with a base coat of Revell Rust, and then dry brush on some Revell of the Brown, followed by some dry brushing of some Revell Bronze to kind of add to the whole rust effect. Then dry brush on some Revell Metallic Silver onto the mesh of the windows. I use some Revell Metallic Steel to paint the gun. Going back to the base, I dry brush on some Revell Metallic Silver onto the grille and the roll cage. For the front shocks I use some Revell Light Blue. For the back ones I use some Revell Luftwaffe Yellow. I then paint the crates using some Revell Mud Brown. The bag on the top I paint with some Revell Olive Green. For the lights I use some Revell Beige. For the straps holding down the boxes I use some Revell Matte Black. I also use this on the wheels too. I use some Revell Bronze for the hubs. And finally, like I usually do, I finish this off with a homemade black wash to blend everything together. And here's the final result. So initially I intended this to be a Rusty Bootlegger's truck, which I think I pulled off quite perfectly. I did opt not to write Rusty Bootleggers on the side, which I had originally planned to do, but I just didn't think there was enough room and I didn't want to end up ruining it, because as you can kind of see, it turned out pretty good. As usual, stick around for the Glamour Shots at the end, as well as a little short animation. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you all in the next one.